Alright, we're going to continue the video because it got cut off. The phone overheated. So, we had basically said before we could start making prescriptions, or at least after we start making prescriptions, we should go back to the descriptive. We should look at society. We should understand how things are centralizing. And I'm going to turn down the air conditioning here. We should understand how things are centralizing, and we should try to describe the world, and we should create a model of the world in the future, what's going on. So, I said there are a couple of models that I think are bad. I think the pressure cooker model is bad. I think the collapsist model is bad. I think the pendulum model is bad, because I think these are basically mystical sorts of narratives that are very deep, that you find them in all kinds of religions throughout the world. And therefore, I think they are too appealing on their mimetic nature, that they appeal to us on the basis that they are familiar, and more so that they're just kind of powerful in themselves. I think there's certain structures, there's an image, like when I say pressure cooker, pendulum, these are images in the brain, these are physical systems, rather than just like an empirical argument. So, I think we should be suspicious of these models. And I think we're sort of biased toward these models in a way that is unproductive. Because I think what these three models allow for is, with the collapse model, you basically say, well, it doesn't matter that my social capital is zero. It doesn't matter that I'm being attacked from all sides. It doesn't matter that I'm at the bottom of society, because after the collapse, everything reverses. Or with the pressure cooker, well, we just keep going. If we just keep getting worse and worse and worse through accelerationism, eventually things will pop off. Or with the pendulum model, as things swing harder and harder and harder away from where we want, it's eventually going to swing back. So all of these basically are a form of accelerationism. They're a form of wishful thinking. They're a form of saying, you know, as things get worse, as things get farther from where we want, ultimately that's good because it's eventually going to come back. I don't think any of that's really necessarily true. Not that it couldn't theoretically, within the realm of possibility, be true, but just that it's not necessarily true. And I don't think we should rely upon those social models. I think a better social model to rely upon is what I'd call an evolutionary model. And the evolutionary model states that basically, in the main, societies and social organisms do not oppose one another fundamentally. They may seem to, and in some cases I think that they have to an extent, but I would say in the main they don't oppose each other. And I'd give the example of Judaism and Christianity, that in some senses you could say Judaism and Christianity are opposites, or another one, you could say Christianity and paganism are opposites. But I would actually make the case that to the extent that Christianity is based off Platonism, and to the extent that it's based off Judaism, it is a continuation and an evolution of those previous religions. So, if what we have now, if we describe it, let's give it a word, let's just say it's liberalism. I think it's an overused word, but let's call it, we can call it anything, liberalism, globalism, whatever you want to call it, humanism, secularism, doesn't matter. Whatever the system is, what comes next is not going to be the opposite. What comes next, you know, if we have globalism now, we're not going to get nationalism. You know, if we have liberalism now, we're not going to get reactionaryism, whatever. So I'm not a reactionary. I don't believe that whatever comes next is going to be the opposite of what we have now. I believe that what comes next is going to be a continuation and an evolution of what comes now. The extent to which systems oppose one another in a continuum, I call that the patricidal element of evolution. And you see this in the religions of the Romans and the Norse, that you have a ancient parent, like a titan, like Cronus, or a giant in the Norse system. You have some kind of ancient parentage, but then you have some son who is rebellious and he kills his father. but the genealogy remains that Zeus is born of Cronus, that Odin is born of the giants. So there's a clear, there's a clear lineage there. There's a clear line of descent, but there's also this patricidal element. And I think that myth is real, especially in the sense that it is representative of the way that social orders change. So the social order we have isn't going to stay the same forever. It's not going to last indefinitely or infinitely. The question is, when will it change and how will it change? And the process by which social orders change, I would argue, is through a minoritarian process. I would argue that this is how nationalism arose in the first place. Nationalism did not arise through the masses of the people rising up and doing what's in their own best interest. Nationalism arose because of a merchant class. And the merchant class did not like two things. It did not like the domination of the priest class through the church, and it also did not like the domination of the warrior class through the aristocracy. And so it said, well, how are we going to undermine these two classes? It said we need to come up with a third power center, which is neither held by the church nor by the state. And it came up with nationalism. Nationalism, in its formation, undermined the church. It was extremely secular. The early nationalists were mostly Freemasons like Giuseppe Mazzini, or Freemasonic adjacent people, Bruno Bauer, Richard Wagner. A lot of these early nationalists were atheistic or even paganistic, believed in some kind of reconstructive paganism. But even if they had their own kind of religion, it was opposed to the established priest class. So they were undermining the established priest class, and additionally they were undermining the existing warrior aristocracy that was in monarchism. So you attack monarchism, you attack the church, and you do that with nationalism. Now, as you undermine those institutions of the monarchy and of the aristocracy and of the church, you don't need nationalism anymore. Nationalism also serves an economic function for the merchant class because it educates, trains, and imbues with new skills this burgeoning factory worker population. That previously you had serfs who worked on the farm for this aristocracy. That economic model becomes outmoded because with mechanization, you have the ability for less people to work on the farms and more people to work in skilled labor, unskilled labor, trades, factory work. So now you want to educate the masses of the people, whereas previously you basically most people needed to do farm work. And there's not much in the way of education that goes into that. You teach them good morals, and they have families, and they work the farm, and that continues ad infinitum. So technological changes, which were created by the merchant class, make nationalism useful for a time, but now we've got automation. In the context of automation, nationalism doesn't make economic sense. Furthermore, in the context of the degradation and domination of both the priest class and the warrior class by the merchant class, it doesn't make sense to promote nationalism as a battering ram. Nationalism is something you use as an excuse to undermine the other two classes. But when you've succeeded, as the merchant class has, you don't need that anymore. So we have to understand the origins of this. And when we understand the origins, we can understand why nationalism is declining. Nationalism is declining because the merchant class no longer needs nationalism as a battering ram against an international European aristocracy and an international church. When the merchant class doesn't need the battering ram gets tossed to the side. And so essentially, when you're a nationalist, you are following the mercantile ideology of the 19th century. That's what you're doing. You're following an outmoded merchant class ideology that they've cast aside. They don't need it anymore. Now, if what the nationalists say is it's true that, nationalism is the perfect political system, it's better than monarchism, it's better than theocracy, it's better than all the other systems. If that was true, then the merchant class would be happy to co-opt it once again. If it was the case that they had to choose between losing their power or re-adopting nationalism, they would re-adopt nationalism. I don't think that will be necessary, but they could. And to that extent, I think nationalism, because it began as a tool of the merchant class, it would return to being a tool of the merchant class, and ultimately it wouldn't help, it wouldn't solve the problem. So the only way to solve the fundamental problems of the world are, from my perspective, and I know I'm speaking in very, lofty terms, solve the fundamental problems of the world. Okay, but I'm saying that at some point, you have to reinvigorate or re-empower a warrior or priest class. And that's not done through nationalism, because nationalism is preoccupied with the masses of the people. What's best for the common man, the proletariat, whatever, for the nation as a whole. But we're not concerned with the nation as a whole at this point. We're concerned with a priest class and a warrior class. And so the activity that goes into those classes toward building up those classes really has nothing to do with the masses of the people, really has nothing to do with a state-based conception of the nation. Now, what gets problematic here is that when we start to talk about nation, people confuse this with the term ethnicity, and I think these are two separate concepts. People who want to make these synonymous are basically, it would be like saying, let's make the terms man and woman synonymous because they both have the root word man, and therefore etymologically they ultimately come from the same place. Yes, natio means birth, ethnos means tribe or type, and so ultimately we can say that these words have a similar origin, one in Latin, one in Greek. But they've come to mean different things. And this is the way the English language works, is we don't, pedantically make words, always revert back to their original meaning. And so when we say nation and nationalism, we're basically referring to a geographical entity with a single state, where a single government has sovereignty over a geographical area, and within that geographical area, within that state, there's going to be a single ethnicity, and that ethnicity is going to be tied to the state in a majoritarian strategy. Now, as I said, the majoritarian strategy, nationalism, as their economic systems, and they are tied to, the specific developments of the factory, and it reached its height in the 19th century. It started to decline in the 20th century, and so you had a lot of conflict between, at that point, switching from the old system to the new system. But my argument is you're not going to bring it back because there's no high-level incentives to bring that back. And in terms of the warrior class and the priest class, the authentic desire of those classes is not toward nationalism either. The warrior class is interested in territory, in conquering space, but not in the sense that we need to have these, nationalism for all peoples, we're going to have these separate states, and we're going to respect your sovereignty. No. The warrior class is concerned with expansion. And so the warrior class is inherently anti-nationalistic because it doesn't respect borders. Its job is to conquer borders, to expand borders. If you call that nationalism, then again, you're equating nationalism with imperialism, which is this same kind of semantic pedantry that I think is regrettable. I think that we have words and they make sense, and we shouldn't confuse them for the purposes of trying to win internet arguments. We should use them in the way that's most pragmatic, that's basically the intersection of their popular meaning and their pragmatic meaning. So when we say something like ethnocentrism, that makes sense, right? You've got an ethnic group, it's ethnocentric. It's ethnocentric in a diaspora. It's ethnocentric within a state. It's ethnocentric nepotistically. That makes sense. That's a phenomenon that we can observe. We can look at imperialism, the way that states invade each other. That's clearly not, respecting each other's sovereignty. And then we can talk about nationalism. And nationalism is this 19th century ideology born in its height in the 1848 revolution, where people said there should be a Germany for the Germans and a Poland for the Poles and everything. It's coming basically from the ideas of binomial nomenclature and all of the Enlightenment thought of the 18th century, that every human being is its own type and should be put in its own state and governed accordingly. That is a very mercantile idea coming out of these scientific revolutions. But that is not authentic, it's not organic, it's not natural. It's, unnatural, essentially. If you're to say anything is natural or unnatural, it would be rather unnatural, because that's not historically how states operate. Traditionally, states, again, they have a class orientation. You've got three classes, but the way that they respect one another, the way that they form power relations to each other, that changes. So if you've got a warrior class in charge, they're going to attempt to use the resources of the state to expand their territory, to expand in space, conquer different territories, exact tribute. This is the Roman Empire, this is the Mongol Empire, and so on. If you've got a priest class and the priest class controls the state, it might also do some expansion, but part of that expansion is not necessarily going to be through military conquest, but through the way that Buddhism expanded, right? Not to say that the Tibetans didn't also have their warrior class, but that much of the expansion of Buddhism was through Buddhist missionaries from Iran going into India, going into China, going into Japan, and spreading that religious and mimetic structure through proselytization, through evangelism, and so on. So that is not nationalism, right? If I'm a Buddhist or a Christian or whoever, and I'm part of a priest class, I'm trying to expand my religion all over the globe, Now, there becomes a conflict when we talk about paganism. Okay, well, what about paganism? Isn't paganism inherently nationalistic because it's nativistic and so on, and you can't transfer it? Well, that's an interesting discussion. But what I would say is you would then have to say that Roman paganism was not pagan, because they would go around and they would, through Romano interpretatio, they would attempt to reconcile different religious systems. And when they went to Jerusalem and they encountered the Jews who did not want to be part of that Romano interpretatio, interpretatio Romana, or whatever it's called, they, smashed the temple and erected a statue of Zeus in the temple, right? So the Romans were also religiously expansionary. This idea of paganistic respect for everyone's rights. Oh, you believe in something different, I believe in something different, we'll just respect each other. That's not the way the Indo-Europeans did it, my friend. And so if you're gonna say that paganism is about respecting everybody's borders and sovereignty and never infringing on each other, then you're gonna have to say that the Indo-Europeans were not pagans, because they aggressively spread their religion from Ireland to Bangladesh. And that's not respecting native religious customs. All these Norse pagans say, well, I respect the Aztecs and I respect the Africans. Everyone should have their own religion. That's not ultimately the way that the Indo-Europeans conducted themselves. So everybody has this belief about tolerance and sovereignty, but those concepts have origins. They have origins in a merchant class. And we can go back even before the 19th century and the 1848 revolution, so we can talk about Protestantism, the way that Protestantism came about, the problems in the Catholic Church at the time. It's not just that the Protestants were merchants, but that the merchant class had infiltrated the Catholic Church to the point where you had the establishment of the first banks. People were starting to, usury was on the rise. Usury's always been around through Judaism in Europe, but usury became more prominent, the selling of indulgences and so on. So the merchant class was gaining power. And, we can go back, okay, where did that come from? We look at the monarchs of Europe alchemy at the time. It was a parallel structure to what was going on with the Enlightenment. You're breaking down traditional structures of religion. You're introducing new ideas. There's economic shifts that are going on. You go back to the Black Plague. So we can keep going back. My point is that the arrow is basically headed in the same direction. It's just in a different rung of the ladder, so to speak, or a different step on the staircase. It's a different position in time, but it's basically the same direction toward, the merchant class is coming in. We're getting rid of these traditional structures, which themselves at some point were revolutionary, right? Every so-called traditional structure, if you go back far enough, at some point was a revolutionary structure. What could be more trad than farming? Well, farming was a revolutionary structure. Hunting and gathering, I guess, you'd say, well, hunting and gathering, yeah, it's been around for a lot longer than farming, but even there, hunting and gathering, that form of predation, being carnivorous, at some point, carnivorism was a revolutionary structure. So, all of this is to say we just need to put these things in context and realize that we have been brainwashed by the merchant class to believe things like nationalism and patriotism are the natural form of human organization, when they are not. The natural form of human organization is much closer to what we would call imperialism, evangelism, globalism at the end of the day. So I believe in globalism. I'm a globalist. I'm not a nationalist. I think I would have been a globalist 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. I would have been a globalist 3,000 years ago. I would have been invading Troy. I would have been colonizing, I would have been leaving Greece and colonizing France and colonizing Russia. Earlier than that, I would be, leaving Ukraine, and I would be going to Ireland. I would be going to Bangladesh. So this is, maybe I'm maybe not me personally, right? Maybe I would just die. I would probably die of disease. I'd probably die of fever. I'm not that robust. The ancient ancestors who did all of that were a lot tougher than I am. But I'm saying that this is much more natural in my opinion. Now, at some point, I think, the whole naturalistic fallacy, what's natural, what's not, that's another semantic argument. But I'm trying to get people out of this concept that, love your people, and I love my people, and therefore, we have the ethnicity, we've got the state, and they have to, mesh together perfectly. That's not how history works. That is a very ephemeral ideology which arose in the 19th century, and which is being phased out. So this is what we need to understand about nationalism, is it is not like the eternal, natural, organic order that we always inevitably return to. No, this is a little temporary blip. This is a product of technology. This is a product of economical thinking. This is a product of secularism. That's where nationalism comes from. I'm not a nationalist. So if I'm not a nationalist, what am I? Well, I use the term minoritarian because I believe that groups exist. I believe that identities exist. And I basically believe that, maybe you're a loner. Maybe you don't care about other people. Maybe you don't want a higher sense of purpose. Maybe you don't want to be a part of a group. It would be hard for me to argue with somebody like that. But I believe that for myself and for most people, we need to be part of collectives. We need to be part of something bigger than ourselves. We need a way to relate with each other. We need an in-group. We need people we can trust. And so how do we achieve that, if not through nationalism? Well, I would argue that nationalism is the worst possible way to achieve these goals because it is so wrapped up in this acquisition of the state that we need to grab hold of the state through party politics or Trump or something like that. That's so far and away from anything possible. We're not going to grab control of the state. You can't even do anything basic, right? What nationalists cannot achieve basic goals here. All they can do is basically grift. All they can do is appeal to an old